Hello everyone, tonight let's walk along ancient trails. Those who cut the sown fields by hand, under a sky that sometimes promised rain, sometimes brought plagues, fields where every grain was counted, and yet it was never enough. This is a night to talk about hunger, but not just any hunger. The hunger of medieval peasants who woke up before the sun, but were never sure whether there would be bread at dusk. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is there. I like to imagine this invisible map of listeners who share silence and story at the same time. Now, close the curtains a little, make the light softer, maybe light a candle, and let us begin our journey tonight. In the heart of medieval Europe, famine was no accident. It was part of the landscape, part of the calendar. Peasants lived surrounded by fields, but they rarely owned what they harvested. The feudal lord took the largest share. The church demanded its own. And what was left often did not survive the winter, nor the invisible plagues that came with the wind. The saw was worked with wooden tools. The arms always tired. The rain could destroy everything in an afternoon. The drought mute the earth for months. There were no greenhouses. There were no resistant seeds. There was only the stubborn hope, year after year, that this time would be better. But often it wasn't. In times of plague or war, the situation worsened. The armies plundered the granaries. Taxes were rising, and fear made the food disappear even faster. Entire families lived of what the land gave, and when the earth failed, it was silence that came first. A silence that took over the village, the soul, the empty stomach. At supper time, there were no more voices, only the sound of the wind passing between the window slats. The conversations that had once filled the air with life became murmurs. And then, nothing. Even the dogs seemed to understand that this was not the time for noise. Hunger had a sound of its own, that of absence. The children stopped running. The old men stopped telling stories. Even the fires burned lower, as if they were also saving their strength. The village, which had once been music and movement, became nothing but shadow and vigil. Every spoon that hit the bottom of an empty bowl was a reminder, a warning that the time of plenty had passed. The human body learns to survive, to walk more slowly, to think less quickly. But the silence, that was the hardest to bear, because it reminded him that it wasn't just the bread that was missing. It was also hope, the color, the sound of life as it was before. And no one knew when or if it would return. The sound of a bite became almost sacred, a bite of something hard, cold, dry. But still, food. The eyes searched the horizon, where sometimes the traveler, the merchant, the miracle appeared. But most of the time, nothing appeared. Just more wind, just more night, and silence. Hunger was a prison. He sat by the fireplace. I slept in the beds with the children. I followed every step, and even without a face, everyone knew her, because she spoke through what was not said, and what was not said was a lot. That was it. When everything was lacking, even the impossible was attempted. Invisible soups were not metaphors. They were actually boiled in deep pots that only held water, almost dead roots, one or two hardened shells. Sometimes not even that. Just water and a handful of salt, if any. Other times, the salt wasn't even there. But the fire, it always burned, because fire was a symbol. It was what was left when there was nothing left. Mothers told children that dinner was almost ready. They let the aroma of hot water spread, as if it carried memories of what was once a real broth. The pot bubbled empty, but the sound of bubbling was still soothing. It was as if the body believed, for a few minutes, that it would be fed. The human brain, even when exhausted, still knows how to dream about the smell of garlic. There was a kind of silent ceremony in those moments. Everyone gathered around the pot, waiting for something they knew would not come. And yet, they waited. Because pretending, sometimes, is a way of surviving. Inventing the flavor. Imagining the weight of the spoon. Pretending that the steam was thick, greasy, full of life. The mind showed what the mouth did not have. And that, for a while, was enough. Some communities used stones. Yes, rocks. A washed rock, left in the bottom of the pot, gave the soup the illusion of substance. It was said that the stone had a flavor if it was boiled well. Sometimes it was said that this stone had fed kings. It was legend, of course, but it was a hot legend, and in the cold of the long nights, that was worth more than any soup. The stories were passed from mouth to mouth, and the mouths, even dry, repeated the words with reverence. Today we have magic root broth, said the grandmother. It tastes like an onion that has laughed in the sun, and the children smiled. Because it was better to believe in magic than in its absence. It was better to imagine a feast fit for kings than to accept an empty pot. The steam from the pot was more nutritious than the broth itself. The heat that came from it warmed hands, faces, hopes, and when the spoon touched the mouth, even if there was only water, it was like a gesture of persistence. The ritual fed something that went beyond the body. It nurtured a sense of belonging, the bond, the shared silence. Today, we choose flavors at the touch of a button. They chose hope and made it their meal because, deep down, they knew that their greatest hunger was not that of their stomach. It was the hunger for dignity. To feel that, even in the face of emptiness, there was still a home, there was still care, and a pot on the stove, even if it only boiled memories. The bread was not soft. It wasn't fresh. Often, it was a stone disguised as flour, so hard that it had to be broken with the handle of a spoon, or with one's own fists, wrapped in cloth so as not to crack the skin. Yet when the bread was placed on the table, silence fell. Because there, in front of that small fermented miracle, there was no room for complaints, just for gratitude. In times of plenty, bread was shaped with care. It gained shape, aroma, color. But in times of famine, it came out crooked, dark, irregular, and yet it was shared like a reliquary. Each piece, even the smallest, carried a story. The wheat used had been hidden from the landlord's collection. The water was fetched from far away. The oven was improvised with old embers. Nothing was simple. Nothing was banal. Biting into that bread was almost an act of resistance. The teeth hurt. His jaw was getting tired, but nobody complained, because chewing meant living a little longer, and living there was a commitment to others. It was to keep the cycle going. It was to set an example for the children. It was to show that the body can adapt, but dignity should not bow. Sharing was done with hands. Hands cracked by the cold, by the hoe, by constant work. Hands that had no time for poetry, but that made poetry by sharing a piece of stale bread. It was an old choreography, an ancestral gesture. The oldest one left. The youngest received. No one ate alone, because the bread alone would dry out faster, and the silence of those who eat without looking at each other hurt more than hunger. Some dipped the bread in hot water to soften it. Others scraped the crust with smooth stones, trying to find something softer in the center. But even so, each bite was a reminder, a confirmation that this was still bread. It was still food. There was still something between the fingers. There was still something to chew. Today, there are pieces left on tables and in bags. There are crumbs left on the streets. But there, at that time, every crumb was saved. It was blown back into the bowl. It was wrapped in cloth and kept in a pocket, because you never knew when the next one would come. The bread was a covenant, an object of faith, a symbol that even hardened sustenance was still possible. And sometimes at night, while everyone was asleep, someone would break off a last piece in secret. They would bite slowly, in silence, not out of hunger, but out of memory, out of fear of forgetting the taste, out of a desire to feel, once again, that the world still offered something, even if it was little, even if it was dry. Still, bread. As the days without food piled up, the body began to accept what it would previously have repulsed. It was an ancestral, silent adaptation, a wisdom forced by despair. When there was no more flour, broth, or bread, all that was left was the land. And the earth, even dry, still held secrets, bitter roots, rough leaves, larvae hidden under warm stones. Eating insects was not a common practice. It was a last resort. But there was something ritualistic about collecting them. Children were taught to identify which ones were chewable and which ones gave them a fever. There were stories of sweet wasps and cocoons that popped in the mouth like dry seed. It was strange, but it was nutritious. It was all there was. The bitter roots had to be boiled more than once. In some regions, they were soaked in running water for days. The attempt was to purge the poison and soften the taste. Even so, they left the tongue numb and the throat scratchy, and the stomach sometimes revolted. But the body got used to it, because hunger taught even what seemed impossible to learn. There were nights when, after these extreme meals, people dreamed differently. Strange, deep dreams, full of colors that seemed not to exist. Some roots provoked vision. Some larvae, when eaten raw, caused high fevers. And in the middle of the feverish sleep, some saw green fields where they had never been. Others heard voices. It was hunger, yes, but also something else. The line between food and poison was thin, and trust was passed down from generation to generation. The grandmother would say, "This leaf cures," that one kills, and the grandson would memorize it, as if he were memorizing spells. Because, in a way, that was exactly what it was. Food in those times was alchemy. It was rudimentary science. It was desperate intuition. Some meals provided sustenance. Others caused delirium. Some saw deceased relatives. Some heard music in the middle of the night. Some talked to stones or danced alone in the cold.
The elders said it was the spirit of the earth talking.
Others called it madness.
But no one judged, because everyone knew that the mind, without food, begins to daydream.
And when the day dawned, they did not always remember what they had eaten, just the taste that remained in the mouth. Metallic, bitter, strange.
But still, it was taste.
It was something. And in that absolute scarcity, even the bad taste was a sign that the body was still there.
It still existed.
I still felt it.
Not all markets sold plentifully. Some were made up of only leftover, bleached bones, dried bark, stalks of already passed leaves. Still, these markets existed, and for many, they were the only chance to find something that could be turned into a meal.
It was a silent, almost ritualistic trade, where the value of each piece was not measured in weight, but in possibility.
Trained eyes could distinguish between what was rotten and what could still be boiled for the last time.
There was skill in this,
A kind of alchemy of the desperate.
It was common to see calloused hands feeling wilted onions, sniffing greenish potatoes, carefully examining animal skins that would have been discarded before.
Here, nothing was trash.
Everything could be turned into sustenance. The smell of these markets was intense. Mixture of cooked meat, cheap smoke, mud and sweat. A smell that stuck to clothes and hair.
But nobody complained.
Because for those who walked miles in search of food, a strong odor was a sign of abundance. Even if crooked, even though it's sad, it was a sign that something could be taken home.
Relationships in these spaces were different.
There was no ostentation. There was no aggressive negotiation.
The vendor knew that the customer was often a neighbor in the same poverty. So, leftovers were exchanged for feathers.
For promises, for last week's stale bread, and sometimes for nothing. Just for the gesture, for the reminder that it was still possible to be generous.
Children who grew up in these markets learned not to turn up their noses. They learned to see value in everything.
The pumpkin peel turned into candy. The cracked bone could be used to make soup. And the already sucked corn cob could be used to add flavor to porridge.
Nothing was useless. Everything had a final use.
And this utility was sacred. There was beauty in it.
A dusty beauty, hidden among makeshift shacks and frayed cloths.
It was the beauty of persistence.
From the look that finds hope at the bottom of the basket.
Of the woman who returns home with a handful of leaves and turns it into a party. Of the man holding a fishbone as if he were holding a medallion.
Back then, even the trash told stories. Stories of struggle, adaptation, dignity. Because the peasants knew that surviving was not just about resisting hunger.
It was resisting the idea that they had become invisible. And in the leftover markets, they proved to themselves and to each other that there was still humanity in small gestures, in the looks, and even in the crumbs. There were days when there was absolutely nothing. No roots hidden under the earth, no bones to boil,
no crumbs left from yesterday.
And on those days, the silence became different. A deeper, thicker silence. It was the silence of forced fasting, of an empty belly that no longer complains, only waits. And waiting there was an almost religious act.
The peasants called these shadow days, because hunger darkened thoughts, and the body began to disappear within itself. But even in those days, there were gestures.
There was routine. The spoon was still placed on the table. The pot was still being washed.
As if by maintaining the ritual, hope was also maintained. As if pretending to be normal was a form of magic. Some sang old songs from better times.
Songs about bountiful harvests, about dinners under the moonlight.
And they sang with their eyes closed, as if praying.
As if trying to summon not food, but the memory of what it was like to have it.
Music became food for the soul.
And the soul in those times needed any sustenance it could get.
There were also silent prayers, but they didn't ask for miracle. They asked for strength.
They asked for time. They asked for the night to pass without delirium, for the next day to bring something on the ground, in the bush, in the wind.
Sometimes a crow flying overhead was a sign.
A root pulled up by chance, a gift.
The universe was heard in detail, because the emptiness of the stomach sharpens the senses.
In some villages, ceremonies were organized, small,
almost invisible.
A circle of stones, an old cloth on the floor.
Each one placed a symbolic object in the center, a button, a twig, a feather, and in silence, they waited.
It was not known for sure what was expected, but the ritual itself was enough. It was a collective reminder that they were still alive. Together.
The empty spoon gained value.
It was raised like a chalice, as if to say, I am still preparing to eat. And this gesture, simple and profound, sustained what was left of dignity. The spoon, the plate, the table, all empty, but everything was still there. Like a stage waiting for the next play.
Like an altar waiting for the sacred bread.
It was like daydreaming.
With a taste of lentils that never came.
But dreaming, there, was a type of resistance, a type of faith.
Because even without food, They still cooked with imagination.
They still sang with dry throats. They still set up tables as if they were expecting guests, visits that might not come. But inside, they were already feeding. When bread got too old, too hard to bite, it wasn't thrown away. It never was. It was transformed.
It was crumbled, soaked in water or curdled milk, and left to ferment in jars darkened by time.
The result wasn't exactly a pleasant drink. It was thick, sour, almost harsh.
But it had an effect.
And that effect mattered more than the taste. The so-called bread beer was common among the peasants. It was not sold. It was done in secret, with the remains, and drunk at night, in silence, like a balm. The light alcohol warmed the body, and more than that, it dulled the hunger. For a few hours, this made his stomach believe it was full. It made the mind forget. It made the eyes close sooner. Around the fire, some families shared parts of this thick liquid, and as they drank, they told stories. Not for fun, but to keep their spirits strong.
So that the drink would not become just an escape, but also a ritual.
Some called it a liquid supper, others a medicine.
But everyone knew that there was more to it than yeast. There was comfort.
Porridge, when it did appear, came from unlikely leftovers. Grated pumpkin peel, ground root flour, a drizzle of honey stored for months. They were thick, heavy, dark.
But they smelled welcoming. Even if it was just for a few minutes, it filled the air with a warm memory.
The steam rising from the bowl was almost like a hug.
Children fell asleep with these flavors in their mouths.
And sometimes that was all they needed. A little warmth in their stomach.
A taste, even a strange one, to anchor their dreams.
The porridge was like a blanket inside.
And even if the anguish remained, it was dulled.
The hunger did not disappear, but it was silenced for a night. Many adults drank more than they should, not for pleasure, but for relief.
Because I had a pain that wouldn't go away with soup, an anguish that only oblivion could calm.
And then they sat in front of the door, watching the night fall, with the glass in their hands. The drink shook slightly, just like them.
It was a liquid supper, somewhere between drunkenness and comfort, a fragile bridge between suffering and sleep.
And even if the next morning brought back the same absence, there was something in those nightly sips that sustained the invisible, a ritual that said softly, "We are still here." Some mornings started like this, with steps, footsteps scratching the dry earth, that traced invisible trails in forgotten fields. Entire families walked without knowing exactly where they were going, but there was a reason that moved them, a reason that was not a destination, nor a map. It was just hunger. Hunger has feet, and no guaranteed destination. They left early.
Before the sun was too strong.
The mothers tied pieces of cloth around their heads. The children, holding hands, tried to keep up.
And the men walked in silence.
There was no conversation, just attentive eyes, scanning the horizon, looking for a fallen branch, a forgotten fruit, a wounded bird, a lucky gesture. It was strange that, walking without direction.
But it was an old habit, passed down from generation to generation, because those who wait for food to arrive die of thirst first.
So they went, with empty baskets, with withered hopes, with steps trained in patience. The path, many times, led nowhere, but still, it was better than staying. The footprints piled up, the trails were marked. Some paths became almost sacred.
They were the hunger route.
Paths that were not on any map, but that lived in the memory of the feet.
And as painful as it was, walking was a way of saying, I still have strength.
I'm still looking.
Today, we walk for health, for leisure, to clear our minds.
They walked for survival. Each step was a question asked to the world. Is there anything here for me? And the world sometimes answered.
An abandoned nest, a stream with small fish,
a bush with leaves that no one else wanted. It was little,
but it was everything. At dusk, they returned,
many empty-handed,
but with calmer eyes, because walking was also a way of processing pain, to leave behind some of the anguish,
to exchange paralysis for hope, even if tired, even without guarantees.
And at home, as they sat back on the cold floor, they felt a little more alive, a little less surrendered.
The body moved even without strength, as if guided by an invisible thread, pulled by the idea that food could be just ahead, and even when it wasn't, something inside them followed, an ancestral instinct, an echo of even more ancient times, because, deep down, they knew hunger does not respect tiredness, but walking is resistance. The silence didn't just come from the adults.
It also came from the little ones, children who, over time, learn not to ask questions,
not to ask,
looking at the empty plate without extending your hand, swallowing the urge to say, I'm hungry, because they knew, because they saw in their parents' eyes that the answer would be regret, not a solution. And in that look, there was already too much answer.
They played with stones, with branches, with pieces of old fabric.
They invented dusty worlds where anything was possible. A button became king's food, a handful of sand, imaginary beans. The floor turned into a stove,
And the imagination, pan.
Playing was the only way to escape the aching body, from the rumbling belly, from the weight that never ended,
Some went to bed earlier.
so as not to feel it.
Others stayed awake, making up stories.
They sang to themselves softly,
They drew in the air with their fingers. Hunger taught them another way of being a child.
quieter.
More alert, less about begging, more about contemplation.
Observation became instinct, empathy, survival.
They were children trained in silence, trained not to disturb,
Not to hinder the efforts of adults, sharing without complaining,
accepting that sometimes the younger brother at first,
leaving MOM to save the last piece for dad, and thanking you anyway.
even when there was only smell, even when there was only heat,
But there was also tenderness,
even in scarcity, the caress of a hand on the hair.
the tight hug at the foot of the bed, the forced smile just to calm down.
The song murmured in the dark.
Childhood, despite everything, still happened.
It still bloomed between roots and wind. He still smiled with dirty teeth and bare feet, because life is stubborn.
Especially in children. Children exchanged crumbs as if they were jewels.
They hid little pieces of stale bread to give to their friends the next day.
They learned that sharing was more beautiful than receiving.
That playing with someone who is also hungry is a relief, a rest, a moment of lightness in the midst of the weight of the world. And when they grew up, these children became adults who knew how to listen.
Who knew how to keep quiet. Who carried in their gaze the memory of the non-request.
From the hunger kept in the chest like a smooth stone. And even many years later, they still dreamed of that time. They could still hear, in the distance, the sound of a spoon hitting an empty bowl. And they understood. There were days when something changed in the air. A smell, a noise, a buzz in the distance.
Someone was returning from the forest with a shot bird, or a handful of corn was taken from the hiding place.
A neighbor shared what was left of the harvest.
A son found an unexpected fish on the riverbank.
And suddenly, without warning, hunger would take a step back.
It was as if the entire village was breathing together, a long, ancient, collective sigh.
The kind of sound you don't hear, but feel. Their eyes met, mouths curved into shy smiles, and the pots came to life.
They started singing again.
The clinking of spoons was music.
The vapor was perfume. The table, water.
The children ran. The adults lit bigger fires. Someone sang. No one gave orders.
It was as if the relief was asking to be celebrated, even if it didn't last long, even if it was just for one night.
There was meat in the pot.
There was fat on the rim of the bowl, and there were stories ready to be born, warmed by the warmth of the reunion.
The village was lit with lights that were not electric, but looked like stars. Each fire was a point of joy, each face illuminated by the flame, a portrait of resistance.
It was as if time had stopped, as if hunger, out of pity or forgetfulness, had gone to visit another village.
And there, for a few hours, there was space to dance. The sound of biting was full. The sound of chewing was almost solemn.
Eating was an act of communion.
And each person who took the food to their mouth also carried the weight of memory.
They knew that tomorrow could be different, but in that moment, there was fullness. A moment when the world fit into a bowl of hot oatmeal. The children fell asleep with full bellies. The old men closed their eyes with quiet tears.
And the younger ones sat near the flames, looking up at the sky, as if trying to give thanks without words. The sky, in turn, responded with silence and stars.
It was a silent pact.
A break between pains. And so, like a brief dream, the hunger left. For a day, for a night. And even if it returned, as it always did, those moments remained, engraved on the body, in the memory, in the sound of the spoon gently hitting the rim of the bowl, in the sound of suppressed laughter, in the sound of a world finally fed. And now that silence returns to the village, not the silence of hunger, but of satiety, of calm.
It is time to rest. Close your eyes if you want.
Imagine the cold breeze of dawn passing between linen curtain, where the aromas of supper were previously hidden. The field sleeps, the pot rests, and the footsteps quieter.
Tonight's story did not come to teach nor to impress. It came to remind that we are made of memory, that there is strength in scarcity, beauty in simplicity, and poetry even in the remains, that dignity does not reside in what one has, but in what one shares.
And that the past, even if hard, can be welcomed like an old blanket forgotten in the trunk.
If this trip took you far away,
Even if only for a few minutes.
well, there are many other gentle weights like this stored here, and there will always be room for one more story, one more lit campfire, one more spoon in the dark.
If this kind of company makes you feel good, Know that I will be here, always, whispering stories that feed not the stomach, but time, the mind.
Sleep.
Now, take a deep breath.
Listen to what's left of the world outside. Maybe the sound of a fan, a distant cup, your own heart.
Let it all dissolve slowly,
Because the day has already passed.
and the night is yours.
Close the windows of thought. And if you want, take me with you in your pillow pocket.
Good night.